Good evening, everyone. I hope you're doing well. I want to explore with you a really powerful idea that emerges from this week's Parshat Vayera. Parshat Vayera has a lot going on in it. It's action-packed. Of course, it begins with the story of Avraham after he received his Brit Milah at the ripe old age of 99, and then um, he's hurting, and then the angels come and they tell him that they're going to have a child, and obviously they laugh. Sarah and Avram, they laugh, and of course, as a result, Yitzchak is named Yitzchak. Then um, after that, there's the whole story of Sodom and Amorah, which we'll talk about tonight. And we have further story where he goes into the house of Paro and once again speaks about his Sarah as his wife. Or maybe I think there is this week's Ishmael. Then after we have the whole story, of course, of the destruction of Sodom and Amorah, the story of Lot and his daughters, the story, and then of course probably the biggest story. Oh, then we also have the issue with Hagar, but then we also have the big story of the binding of Isaac, Akedat Yitzchak, which really demands the majority of our attention when we look at Parshat Vayera. But I want to explore another idea where we will look, and I think it does have what to do with the story of the binding of Isaac and some of the themes there. But we'll look at the story of Sodom and Amorah. And this is based upon an idea that that I received, that I learned from a source that I've been sharing with you guys in the past, and that is, of course, Aleph Beta, he's really fantastic. Rabbi David Fohrman, really, really brilliant Torah scholar. And Rabbi Fohrman often uses the story of Gan Eden as a way through which he explores. You see the story of Gan Eden weaved through all these other narratives throughout the Torah. And that makes sense. I mean, certainly Kabbalistically, and this is, we talk about how every mitzvah, in essence, is there to somehow be mitakein, to fix the sin of Adam and Chava. Right? The sin of Adam and Chava is not necessarily seen as some sort of historical event. I mean, though maybe it was, but it's more than that. It becomes a paradigm for human behavior. And so what we see is this message, this idea of the story of Gan Eden. Really it shows up in very strange places. And this week's Parsha is one of them. And Rabbi Fohrman points out that there are, of all places, there are 8 linguistic connections made between the story of Sodom and Amorah and the story of Gan Eden, of what happens in Gan Eden. And so what we're going to talk about initially is we're going to look at, well, first 7, but eventually these 8 kind of ideas, these little pieces of language, and then we're going to see how then they repeat themselves in the story of Sodom, and we'll wonder why. Okay, we'll question, why is that? Why do they repeat themselves? So there's this idea, of course, that after Adam and Chava are kicked out of Gan Eden, this verse that we'll come back to again, it says, Vayigaresh et Adam. Adam was kicked out. Vayashkein mikedem legan Eden. He's stationed to the east of Eden, east of Eden, right? The Steinbeck novel. Mikedem legan Eden et hakruvim, the kruvim that lat hacherev hamitapechet, and this fiery, ever-turning sword. Lishmor derech etz hachaim, to guard the way to the tree of life. And so that's the end of the story, this kind of wild sort of thing, that they're kicked out of Gan Eden. And it's not just that they're kicked out, they are stopped from coming in by these kruvim. and some rotating fiery sword trying to get back into the Garden of Eden. And so we want to wonder, how do we get back into the Garden of Eden? What does it mean that there's this kind of fiery sword that's stopping us from going? Okay, and that is just by way of some sort of introduction. We'll come back to this verse in a moment, but we're going to look at, like I said, 8 different ideas, themes, even just, pieces of language that show up. Sorry, I want to do that. That show up throughout in the story of Gan Eden, and then will repeat themselves in the story of Sodom and Amorah. The first one is this verse. Vayomer Hashem Elokim hein Adam haya kechad mimenu. Now, this is after Adam and Chava eat from the tree. It says, now that man has become like one of us, ladat tov v'ra, knowing good and evil, v'ata pen yishlach yado, lest he stretches out his hand. So we're going to see that this word, pen yishlach yado, will show up again. He'll also take from the tree of life and eat and live forever. I don't want to get into what that means now, what the concern there is, but keep that in mind, this idea of pen yishlach yado, sending out his hand. Have I frozen? Am I still with you? Yeah, can you see me? Still with me? Okay, so the first thing is pen yishlach yado. The second one, vayishalchehu Hashem Elokim gan migan Eden la'avod et ha'adama asher lukach misham. We deal with some sort of banishment, vayishalchehu, and they are banished, kicked out of the Garden of Eden. Okay, banishment, we'll come back to that again. So too, we have this idea of Vayigarish et Adam. This is a verse that we saw just a moment ago. Vayishkan migan la'edem et hakruvim vet lat hamit hapechet. Okay, it's called, where are they? They are in a Gan Eden. They are in some sort of garden, and that's significant. Also, not only that, there's something called, right, it's this, it's to the east of a garden, okay? 1 second, give me a second here. All right, sorry, somebody sent me a private message. All good. Any questions so far? How are we going? I know we're kind of just building something up in the moment, but is everything clear at the moment? Yeah, all good? Okay, what's element number 4? Vayishluchu ha'anashim et yadam vayaviu et lot alehem habayta vet hadalet sagaru. Who are these anashim? You can unmute yourself if you wish. Who are these anashim? You got to mute yourself if you do want to say something.
The people of Sodom.
No. Otherwise, he'd be in trouble. Who are these anashim here?
No, it was the people of Sodom on the outside.
Yeah. So who pulled Lot into the house?
Abraham.
Sorry.
Was it Abraham who pulled?
No, Abraham's not there.
No?
בסדר, יאללה, אני הולכת על זה.
Dov, who are the Anashim? We lost him. They're angels.
Yes, malachim, they're on the angels.
Yeah, so they're called Anashim, but these are angels. So again, we've got these angels. They will show up, of course, in the story of Sodom and Amorah. Finally, it says, Vayisa lot etayna v'eret kol kikar yarden ki kula mashke lifnei shachat Hashem et Sodom v'et Amorah kigan Hashem Okay, it's called, we mentioned that earlier. Sorry, this is one that we should have spoken about earlier. This here we talk about that it was, oh no, sorry, what am I doing here? My apologies. Getting a little confused here. Okay, so we have the one second. Yeah. Angels. And then, sorry, we've got our themes here. Okay, sorry. So we have, what do we have so far? Just to be a little bit, just to do a bit of review. So far we've seen that they were kicked out of the Garden of Eden. Okay, they've been sent out. Then we have this idea of lishloach yad, to send a hand. Okay. Then we have this idea that it took place in a garden. So just like Gan Eden, as we'll see in a moment, was in a garden, so too we'll see that repeating in the story of Sodom and Amorah. Then we have, of course, angels. Angels appear in both story. If you remember, we mentioned here, there is a lahat hacherev hamitapechet. So there is a what? A fiery sword, okay? This fiery sword, which we'll come back to. Plus, it's hamit hapechet, this idea of it being, what's mitapechet? It's turning around. We'll see that language repeat itself as well. So we see, again, we've built up all of these different kind of language messages, and let's see how they repeat themselves in the story of Lot. So first, this is much earlier. This is in last week's Parsha, where we are first introduced to Lot. If you remember, there was this whole story where Avraham, at that point he was Avram, he was starting to get a bit wealthy, and he and Lot were trying to work out, before they were going to work out which way they needed to go. And Lot, what does he choose? Right, they have a bit of a falling out, and Lot chooses, Vaisa Lot et einav, vayar et kol Kikar hayarden kichula mashke. Lifnei shachat. So the story, they give away the story here. Lifnei shachet Hashem et Sodom vet Amorah kigan Hashem. Right? So Sodom is called Kigan Hashem. Why is it called Kigan Hashem? Like the garden of God.
Because before God destroyed Sodom, it was obviously a very, according to the story, it was a beautiful green.
Yeah, it's like the Fertile Crescent, right? This is where it's all happening. It's fertile, it's green, it's, it's beautiful. And this is what Lot chooses. So again, we see here this idea of it being Kigan Hashem, that language of it being a garden. Okay? Then, what else do we see? Vayivchar lo Lot et kol kikar hayarden, vayisa Lot mikedem, vayipardu ish me'al achiv. Lot chose for himself, this is just after that story in last week's Parshat Lech Lecha, Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan, and Lot journeyed eastward. Kedem, that's again the repetition of we saw that after they were kicked out mikedem legan Eden. Okay. Of course, what do we have? We have Vayakumu Misham Ha'anashim in the story of Sodom and Amorah. Who are these Anashim? They're angels, right? We have these angels who are appearing. And of course, there's angels in the story of being in Gan Eden. Okay. Then, we spoke about how? Give me a moment here. We spoke up above how when they were kicked out of Gan Eden, there was this fiery, flaming sword, Hamit HaPechet, that turned things over quite literally. If you look here, it said, what does it say? There's Hashem himtir al Sodom v'Amorah gofrit va'esh, this fire that was coming out. It's not the same language, obviously, but again, there's some sort of intense fire that destroys. And what does it do to it? Vayahafoch, right? If you remember, we said that there was this fiery sword, hamit hapechet, that turns things up and down. So too, So too, we say, "Vayhi b'shachet elokim et arei hakikar vayizkor lim et Avram vayishlach lo mitoch ha'hafecha." That same language of Lot being removed from the upheaval. We have the cherev hamitapechet and this ha'hafecha. Give me 2 seconds. I'm just going to pause here for just one moment. I'll be with you in 2 seconds. All right, sorry about that there. Just had to relocate here. So, again, we're seeing these linguistic connections being made between the two stories. Any questions up until now? How are we going? Paul, you look confused.
Oh, well, I'm waiting.
You're waiting to wonder what are we doing with all these sorts of things?
What's coming next, right?
Okay, so again, hopefully we have seen whether or not is a good question, but hopefully we have seen the sort of linguistic connection being built and being made, and the question is, well, what, right? Why? What's going on here? What's really, So what is the parallel, if you will, to Avraham? Sorry. You see you see my source sheet here. I feel like I've just closed the document. Can you still see the source sheet? Yeah, okay. What is really the connection? What's going on here? What's the message that's being communicated with these sorts of language connections? So really, what was the sin? I'll open it up for you guys now. What was the sin of Sodom and Amorah? What do we know about Sodom and Amorah? What was their sin? What do you think?
The language implies sort of loose living and sexual immorality, but that may be a later interpretation of it. I mean, that's the message which...
Okay, so there's some sort of sexual immorality. Yeah, possibly, definitely, right? What else? Anything that we know? I mean, definitely, I mean, they were trying to do something terrible there with the story of, Lot and his daughters. I mean, awful. But what do you think, Lauren?
They weren't particularly kind.
Yeah, we know that they were especially unkind, right? And that was
to strangers. Yep.
Exactly. So, and especially to strangers, right? And so it's possible to see, and these things were all true, but maybe there was something else underneath it that was actually, because there were many situations of kind of immoral civilizations and societies. Give me a moment here. Sorry, guys. This is the problem of doing it over Zoom. There were many immoral civilizations back then, I'm sure, but what was different about Sodom and Amorah? So let's look back in the sources and maybe get a bit of an insight. This verse here is actually quite telling. It says, Terem Yishkavu. This tells a story that the angels came to really warn Lot and get him out of there. Terem yishkavu v'anshei ha'ir, anshei Sodom nasabu al habayit, minar ve'ad zaken, kol ha'am mikatzeh. They had not yet laid down when the townspeople, the men of Sodom, young and old, all the people to the last man, gathered about the house. What's strange about that verse? What stands out to you?
Maybe they named twice the people of the city, Anshe Shiur and Anshe Sodom.
Okay, interesting. I'm sure there's something to be said about that, but I think maybe there's, that's a good pickup. I don't know what that's teaching us. I think there's something else that I want to focus on that also kind of really calls out to us.
It seems a bit weird that they all converged.
Yeah, they all, and more specifically,
Just the men.
Minar ve'ad zaken. Right, it's just the men, but minar ve'ad zaken, from child to the elderly. Is this a lynch mob? Doesn't seem like it, right? A lynch mob, you got a couple of hotheads, right? Yeah. This is something different. Here we're talking about institutionalized immorality. Here we're talking about a society that actually, right, this was what they did. Why did they do that? I think it relates to what Lauren was saying before. If you look at what the Ramban here mentions, he says, Kavanatam, why did they do this? What are they doing, right? Why did they basically go to try to rape these men? Kavanatam lichalot et haregel mi beinehem. Their intention was to stop guests from coming to them. Kidivrei Rabotenu, as it says, our master said, Ki chashvu shebavor tovar artzam shikegan Hashem yavo sham rabim. Right? They thought that they lived in this really great place, and what's going to happen? People are going to come, the immigrants, right?
Yep, and try and enrich themselves with the...
Yeah, all these immigrants are going to come, and they're going to steal all of our
resources.
They're going to take what we've worked so hard for, right? And remember, they lived in a garden, right? They lived in Kigan Hashem. It's like a garden, and they were worried. So what did they do? They made themselves a bad name because they didn't want people to come. The Ramban goes on to mention that Lot, why was Lot allowed to settle? Because Lot was already wealthy. So they knew that Lot wasn't coming to kind of take stuff from them. But what we're seeing here is not simply a few bad apples or a lot of bad apples. We're seeing an institutional immorality. Minar ve'ad zaken, young and old. This is what they educated. This is what they told people. They created.
And also to add to that, it happened straight away, sort of before they had time to lie down. That they were onto them. This is something that had been planned and had been well executed in the past by everyone.
Totally, exactly. Like they knew what to do. Somebody came up, let's go. Right? It didn't take very long in those days. They didn't have WhatsApp, right? They just knew exactly what to do, and they showed up at these guys' house. I think it's that was Peter, yeah?
Yeah.
Cool, good to hear you. So this is the idea. They knew exactly what to do, and this was kind of expected. Okay? Thoughts, questions, concerns? What do you think? Okay.
Well, one question would be,
Sure.
The assumption is that the people who are going to watch this will understand that they are engaging in immoral behaviour. Where do they get that knowledge from?
Sorry, say that again.
If this is, you're saying this is kind of a mass act that the people are putting on in order to frighten other people away. Don't come here. Don't come to our land because we're bad people. go away. Is that the message? Who are the people who are going to see this, who would know that this is immoral behavior? Where do they learn that from?
How do they know that sodomizing someone is immoral behavior?
Yeah, this is a fairly new experience in the history of mankind, isn't it?
Yeah,
I mean, early generations.
Well,
it's an
no,
interesting question, interesting point. I mean, long enough, I think, for people to understand that there was some immorality here. But I hear your point. I hear the point. The Ramban, who made this point, is seeing it through the lens of, 11th century, right? Where obviously this has been well accepted that this is an immoral thing. But even, it's still seen, certainly in those days, in kind of more ancient tribal days. I mean, you can imagine that to do such a thing would be considered a great affront to the dignity of a human being. But I hear your point. Maybe we're reading too much into this.
Well, the implication then is that there is a set of moral teachings which human beings are expected to know and to understand.
From the Torah's perspective, there's no question.
Yeah, sure.
I disagree with that, because there were certainly other societies, certainly later, but like the Romans and the Greeks and so forth, for whom relationships between men and women were perfectly okay.
But that's not exactly what we're talking about here, right? If it's consensual within ancient civilizations, there were certain civilizations where it would have been permitted. But here it's gang rape on visitors to a town. I can imagine that's even in those days would be considered quite an immoral thing. I would imagine. We built earlier these 7 kind of linguistic connections. We weren't precise in kind of pointing them out. I should maybe organize the text one after another so we can see the direct connection. But there's an 8th connection. There's an 8th linguistic similarity, and that's a verse that we've seen a couple of times already. Remember, Adam and Chava are kicked out of Gan Eden. And then there are these kruvim that are placed there to protect. And it says, "Vayigarsh et Adam vayeshkein mikerem legan Eden et kruvim et lat acheret mitapechet lishmor et derech eitz hachayim." These kruvim and this fiery sword are there to protect, to guard the way of the tree of life. Lishmor et derech eitz hachayim. This word of lishmor et haderech, to protect the path, repeats itself in the story of Avraham and Sodom before the destruction. If you remember, God comes to Sodom and tells him, well, the angels come and tell him. And then Avraham engages in some back and forth about, some haggling as to, what's the amount of righteous people that are needed to be inside that city in order to not be destroyed. That's a fascinating topic for another time of exploration as to what was Avraham going on about there. But what do we see here? We see earlier that Hashem Amar, God says, will I hide from Avraham that which I'm doing? The Avraham hayo yiyeh legoy gadol ve'atzum v'nivrchu bo kol goyei haaretz. Avraham is going to become a great and populous nation, and all the nations of the earth are to bless themselves by him. Ki yidativ leman asher yitzavet banav et beito acharav v'shamru derech Hashem. So we have again this idea of Avraham being chosen. Why was Avraham being chosen? Because he's going to protect the derech Hashem. He's going to protect this path, which, if you remember, it reminds us of this idea of Adam and Chava were kicked out of Gan Eden, and protective measures were put in place in order to guard the way of the tree of life, lishmor, to protect something. The people, and Avraham is chosen, he knows God trusts him because he's shamru derech Hashem. It doesn't say derech eitz hachayim, but it's the same thing. It's the same thing. Avraham is going to guard derech Hashem. What is the derech Hashem? What is the way of Hashem? Lasot tzedakah umishpat. Avraham, we know, God says, why have I chosen him? And one of my rabbis, Rabbi Shlomo Riskin, points out over and over and over again that the reason why Avraham is chosen is because God had faith. He quotes this verse all the time. God had faith that Avraham would teach his family to guard the way of God, to do tzedakah umishpat. So this derech Hashem, what is the derech Hashem? What is the path of God? It is somehow finding this balance between tzedek and mishpat, between what is just and what is right. To find that balance. These linguistic connections between the story of Sodom and Amorah and the story of Gan Eden does a couple of things. But in essence, what it's doing is it's kind of saying that this falling apart, if you will, of society, of civilization, is some sort of a carrying on of the very same things that got us kicked out of the Garden of Eden. When they were in the Garden of Eden, they didn't do tzedakah umishpat. They violated those principles. And as such, they were kicked out. And that continues to kind of manifest itself in a societal sense with the people of Sodom and Amorah. They did not create a civilization of tzedakah umishpat, of both justice and that which is right, of mishpat and tzedakah. Now, we entitled this shiur, Sodom, City of Justice. Is it a city of justice? The city of Sodom? In what way could we possibly understand it as a city of justice, based upon what we've seen thus far? What do you think? Any suggestions?
Probably their own justice that they apply.
Yeah. What do you mean? Can you go deeper in that?
Well, it's probably capricious. It's probably, as you said, to send a message to everyone else, to the immigrants, they're not welcome. It's capricious justice.
Exactly. Right. It's justice, but it's not what we would consider real justice. But they were upholding it. Minar vad zaken. Child and adult. They had certain ways of the ways that they did things. And in essence, who was breaking their system?
The immigrants.
Well, in this specific situation, who broke it? Lot, right? Lot went against the rules. He brought people in. You don't do that. Right? You don't do that. And that was that whole thing, right? Like Lot didn't get it. According to this theory, Lot offered him his daughters, which is like an abhorrent thing, right? But that's not what they wanted. It wasn't about the daughters. It wasn't about some insatiable sexual urge. It was about sending a message that visitors aren't welcome here. And so as such, they held up their form of justice. You wanted to say something, Lauren?
No.
No. So here's the challenge with society, right? We always have to create. We have to find that balance between mishpat and tzedakah. Forgetting, of course, the perverse form of mishpat, okay? Sodom and Amorah had their own versions. But we have to create a society that is fair, right? everybody, there's justice, right? Everybody gets a fair shake. Everybody gets certain opportunities. We have to, and what happens, and we all get certain access, but what happens when somebody falls down on their luck? Somebody makes mistakes and they become, God forbid, homeless. Do we, in a system of pure justice, do we reach out to them? Not necessarily. Not necessarily, right? Justice doesn't necessarily demand that person, they messed up. Okay, they had certain opportunities, but they blew their opportunities. They made one too many mistakes, and here they are. There's an element of mishpat, but we can see how mishpat, which is so necessary, so important for the world, how it itself can alone, Suki, it alone can be perverted. So we need also this idea of tzedakah, which again, we look at it as charity. I want to read a quote from Rabbi Sachs here in a moment, which I think kind of brings this home. Lauren, you unmuted yourself? No? Whenever you unmute yourself, then it's dangerous, okay? Let's take a look at what Rabbi Sachs says here. Mishpat alone cannot create a good society. To it must be added tzedakah, distributive justice. One can imagine a society which fastidiously observes the rule of law and yet contains so much inequality that wealth is concentrated in the hands of the few and many are left without the most basic requirements of a dignified existence. There may be high unemployment and widespread poverty. Some may live in palaces while others go homeless. This is not the kind of order that the Torah contemplates. There must be justice, not only in how the law is applied, but also in how the means of existence, wealth as God's blessing, are distributed. That is tzedakah. Tzedakah cannot be translated because it joins together two concepts that in other languages are opposites, namely charity and justice. Suppose, for example, that I give someone $100. Either he is entitled to it or he is not. If he is, then my act is a form of justice. If he is not, it is an act of charity. In English, as with the Latin term caritas and iustitia, I don't know how to pronounce that, a gesture of charity cannot be, it should be just justice, right? A gesture of charity cannot be an act of justice, nor can an act of justice be described as charity. Tzedakah is therefore an unusual term because it means both. It arises from the theology of Judaism, which insists on the difference between possession and ownership. Ultimately, all things are owned by God, creator of the world. What we possess, we do not own, we merely hold it in trust for God. This is the clearest example is the provision in Vayikra. The land must not be sold permanently because the land is mine. You are merely strangers and temporary residents in relation to me. So there's this idea of, first off, just give me 1 second. My dog's just being funny. Hold on a second.
Weak, isn't it, from the story of Washington.
Sorry. There's this idea, first off, of trying to find that balance between tzedakah and mishpat, that we recognize that mishpat alone, if it's a society simply built, purely built upon mishpat, on justice, the world can't really exist in such a way. Society will fall apart. There needs to be this act of tzedakah. But tzedakah is not, as we saw, is not simply an act of charity, of giving someone to something that they don't deserve. There's something deeper going on there. There's an idea that actually what I am blessed with, that too, I may have worked for it, but it's a blessing from Hashem. The land does not belong to me. Nothing really belongs to me. I've been given these things. I've been given these things in order to look after, but they don't really belong to me. So what is the derech Hashem? What is the derech Hashem? What is the path? What is the path of God? The path of God is somehow trying to find a way of balancing that. Adam and Chava are kicked out of Gan Eden because they themselves don't live a life of balance. They don't live a life of really understanding where things come from, which is really at the root of tzedakah. They're kicked out of it. So too, Sodom and Amorah, they may have mishpat, but they don't have tzedakah. And as such, they are wiped out. And it's kind of like this, a continuation of the story of Gan Eden, a continuation of that story. The Torah, however, is this Eitz HaChaim, right? The Torah is the tree of life. And so we saw how there are these angels that stand with a revolving sword to guard the path to the Derech Eitz HaChaim. Well, we call the Torah Eitz Chaim Hila Machazikim Ba. The Torah is the tree of life. The Torah, the purpose of the Torah is to allow us to live a life of mishpat, of proper judgment, of making sure that we do things that are right according to the Torah society, Torah's ideas, ideals, and also societies, but also tzedakah. There's got to be this element of doing that which is right, that which is right because it goes according to we're tuned into the awareness that it's really God's world. It's not ours. And so we share, and we look after the poor, and we look after the immigrants, and we show kindness. These are the values that are communicated very clearly in the Torah. You don't need any spin in order to see very clearly that the Torah has a system of welfare, and the Torah, recognizes that there's going to be people who are poor. The Torah has a system of welfare. The Torah tells us to look after the strangers that come into our midst. When we fully understand that the resources that we have are a blessing from Hashem, then we will, we'll be able to share them with others. We'll be able to share them with others. And so I think that this is a powerful lesson, and a challenging one, but a powerful lesson that comes out, that emerges from the story and the comparison between the story of Gan Eden and the story of Sodom and Amorah. I'm wondering what you guys think. Are you convinced? Any thoughts? Any questions?
I think you may be drawing some parallels between our existing societies and the
Don't
way
read into it too much there.
No, but they're not all the same, the various societies we might be thinking about.
Yeah.
But certainly the imbalance between the two is remarkable in some parts of the world.
Yeah. Wouldn't you say the imbalance of the term of what? I'm sorry?
Imbalance in the between justice and charity, and the arguments used for saying, in effect, well, if they're poor, they deserve it because they're not, people haven't worked enough for it. We've worked it. This is our money. Right. We're not going to give it away to anybody else. If somebody's badly off, they've probably done something bad to deserve it, and I'm not going to help them. That sort of attitude, which is a fairly common one in some parts of the world.
Unfortunately.
Is, I think, at the core of some of the issues that we're dealing with right now in the 21st century.
Yeah, no question. Yeah. Any other thoughts, questions? So that's what I have to share with you. I found it to be a powerful message. I love Rabbi Fohrman's stuff. I think this idea needs to be developed a bit further. And he said that he might look into developing into a podcast. They create really high level content. So I do highly recommend you check out aleph-beta.org. And with that being said, I wish you guys a Shabbat Shalom, and I hope to see you all very, very soon.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Take care.
See you guys.
Thank you.
Rabbi.
Thank you very much.
See you, Dov. Take care. See you, Bernie. All the best.
Bye.